Good day. In my last video, I said that the fog of war was lying heavily over the battlefields in Ukraine, and this fact was seized on by some people to suggest that the fighting, that the Russian offensive in Ukraine had in some way stalled. A Ukrainian official, a top Ukrainian official, said that the war was at a standstill. The Institute for the Study of War in Washington, a institute or parent institute, apparently run largely by members of the Kagan-Nuland family. They said that Russia had not announced any territorial gains in Ukraine for the first time since the early weeks of July. And there's also been some other discussions and suggestions that the front lines in Ukraine have actually become stable. This is not the case, and in fact, we've had more information trickling in over the last few hours that the situation for the Ukrainians is intensifying. It's becoming more difficult almost by the hour, with further news that the Russians have now broken into Soledar from the north as well as from the east, and that there is now fighting around the high-rise buildings in the center of the city. Very often when fighting takes place in Ukraine, the Russians, especially when they're involved in complex operations, give out instructions to the various Russian reporters who are covering the war, many of them on the front lines, that the situation has become sensitive and that they don't want the actual state of military operations to be publicized. By way of example, there's been some reports from the area northwest of Kharkiv where the Russians have been pushing south from a town they captured last week called Udi, that there's been machine gun fire, heavy rifle fire, heard by the inhabitants of a town well to the south of Udi, suggesting that there's actually intense fighting going on near this town. This is something which neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians have reported. And it's a classic example of how sometimes things can actually be happening on the battlefield which go unreported because the Russians and the Ukrainians don't want the fact to be reported. Now, the Military Summary Channel yesterday, in its run-up of the news, suggested that sometimes this is because the Russians don't want to give a premature report that they've captured some particular place in case they're pushed back from it, and the same applies to the Ukrainians, and I've no doubt that that is true. But of course it's also the case that each side, perhaps especially the Russians, want to keep their battle movements secret, so that the other side isn't fully aware of all of the things that they're doing. And this can sometimes cause confusion, but it is, I would suggest, an inevitable consequence of war. There is another factor which the Military Summary Channel also mentioned, which I'm sure is true, and that is that yesterday it was 2 weeks since the Russians began the very latest advance they have launched in Donbass. And the Military Summary Channel was suggesting that the Russians may be carrying out a troop rotation. They may be replacing some of the troops who have been fighting hard on the front lines with fresh troops, giving the troops that have been fighting so hard time to rest and recuperate and be reinforced and resupplied. And that, of course, is entirely logical, and it makes complete sense. And I suspect that that's also partly a factor in what has been going on. Nonetheless, it is the case that fighting has been happening. Offensives, the Russian offensive Slow motion, as it may appear to be, has been continuing. The Russians are now said to be just 5 kilometers from Ugledar, the town, this important town on the which forms part of the linchpin of the Ukrainian defenses in southern Donetsk. They've cut the road between Ugledar and Marinka, this fortified village area opposite Donetsk city, which has been a target for Russian attack since the fall of Pesky. The Russians have been reported in some sources to now control 2/3 of Marinka, and the Ukrainians admitted for the first time that the Russians are in total control of Pesky, that important fortified village that the Russians captured over the last few weeks. The Ukrainians admitted for the first time that the Russians are in total control of it, though they did it in a very indirect way. They reported fighting north of Pesky by Russian or militia troops advancing north from Pesky in a way that effectively admitted that Pesky is now under Russian control. And in fact, what seems to be happening is that the Russian forces are gradually edging north from Pesky towards the Donetsk ring road. This is a big ring road that used to surround the city of Donetsk. Donetsk city is and has been under militia control since 2014. There's fighting in places like Pesky, Marinka, Avdiivka. These are the suburbs of Donetsk city, recaptured by the Ukrainians over the course of the 2014 fighting, and the area which the Ukrainians most heavily fortified in the 8 years since that fighting in 2014 and the fighting which began this year. And the Russians seem to have pushed north from Pesky. They seem to be pushing towards the Donetsk ring road, another area which the Ukrainians appear to have fortified, but they seem to be edging towards that ring road, and they seem to be prepared to take or to attack Ukrainian formations and Ukrainian defenses on that ring road. And they've also been pushing south towards Marinka, which, as I said, they apparently now control around 2/3 of. And they also are no doubt advancing along this ring road in a way that is intended to eventually encircle Avdiivka, the much bigger small town suburb area of Donetsk, which is the place where apparently a lot of the Ukrainian artillery which has been shelling Donetsk is concentrated. Avdiivka is a bigger place, it's more heavily fortified, and it will take longer to capture. And as I've said earlier, the Russians seem to be further north. They seem to have entered Soledar, not a big place, by the way, a large village or small town, if you like, but perhaps best understood as a northerly suburb of Bakhmut, the linchpin of the Ukrainian defenses in central Donetsk region, that the Russians seem to have entered Soledar from two directions. And as I said, there's now apparently heavy fighting going on in the center of Soledar. And there's also information that the Russians have been continuing to capture or clear villages and settlements south of Bakhmut city as well. So it's far from being a standstill. You can see that the Russians are gradually tightening their grip around Bakhmut city. If Soledar falls, which it may very well do within the next couple of days, then my own feeling is that the Battle of Bakhmut will have begun in earnest, and the city may no doubt will be defended by the Ukrainians for a while. But I doubt that the Ukrainians will be able to hold on to Bakhmut for very long. We could even, perhaps, it's just a possibility, see a collapse in Bakhmut at a similar speed to the sort of collapse we saw when the Russians stormed into Severodonetsk weeks ago in the first big attack on an urban center in Lugansk region, which led to the progressive collapse of the entire Severodonetsk, Lysychansk conurbation. So we might start to see something like that happen in Bakhmut as well. Though the Ukrainians will work very hard, I think, to try to defend Bakhmut for as long as possible. So, Russian advances in the south, near Ugledar, Russian advances opposite Donetsk city, with the Russians pushing towards the Ring Road and steadily, incrementally gaining more and more control of Marinka, this fortified village. Russians pushing deeper into Solidar, gradually moving to encircle Bakhmut, and activity also going on further north in Kharkiv region, which we don't fully understand because there is a news blackout about it. There's also been more reports, by the way, of Russian advances south of the Izium bridgehead towards Slavyansk. Again, we have very little information about this, except a rather grisly report that the Russians claim to have found the bodies of a number of Ukrainian women who apparently were murdered, presumably the Russians would say, by Ukrainian forces during the fighting in March. All I would say about those kind of claims is what I always say about all claims of this nature, which is that I'm not going to assume they are true until and unless they are corroborated in some way by a proper independent investigation, which in this war, I'm afraid, I never expect to see happen. So that's the situation on the actual battle lines. There's been what you might call some virtual events as well, which is that apparently some Ukrainian drones approached an airfield, a Russian airfield near Sevastopol, and another drone apparently seems to have approached the Crimea bridge, and in both cases, both drones appear to have been shot down by the Russian air defense. And this led to all sorts of excited reports which still appear in the media about lots of explosions, Western media, lots of explosions in Crimea. But the Russians are, as at the time of making of this video, still insisting that those explosions were simply the noise of the Russian air defenses coming into operation, shooting down these Ukrainian drones. Now, if these were drone attacks, then that might raise some possibilities. It may be the case that what I've assumed have been sabotage attacks in Crimea are actually drone attacks, that it was a drone that dropped some kind of explosive device on that ammunition depot in Saki, in the Saki airfield, which we were discussing about a week ago. There was another drone that launched some sort of attack on this on that ammunition depot in northern Crimea, and that rather than a sabotage or underground cell operating in Crimea, it may be that the Ukrainians are carrying out these pinprick attacks using some kind of drones. Now, I presume that it is possible to create light drones which can cover distances of perhaps 200 kilometers from Ukrainian controlled territory, though I'm not sure that that is possible, and that these drones can drop some sort of small explosive device on a particular target. And it may be that these drones move quite slowly, and that may explain one of the reasons why they're not detected. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a technical engineer. I'm not able to discuss these things. But there was an article, a rather curious article in The Guardian, in which a Guardian journalist went and interviewed a Ukrainian major general who, again, and obviously asked him questions about this great Kherson counteroffensive, which, as we've discussed, isn't happening. And the general diverted the discussion by saying that Ukraine is going to capture Kherson, but it's not going to be through some kind of great offensive, because the Russians so heavily outgun Ukraine in this area, but it's going to be through pinpoint attacks by light drones. And the article then discussed at some length how some Ukrainian operators are using drones to carry out pinpoint attacks on Russian positions. And it did make me wonder whether maybe there's some kind of Ukrainian unit which has been formed which has got these drones, which Ukraine may have developed itself, and that they're being perhaps flown over Kherson region towards Crimea. They've not so far been detected or properly detected by Russian radars, and assuming that these drones do have the range, and we're talking about perhaps 200 kilometers, they're able then to launch strikes on particular facilities, in military facilities in Crimea. Now, this is pure speculation on my part, based to some extent on this article and on the fact that these sabotage raids appear to have been largely carried out by drones. Remember, there was a drone attack on the headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet about 2 weeks ago. So that might have been an early example of that kind of attack which the Ukrainians may have organized. And it may be that this is a technology that the Ukrainians have developed by themselves. Now, I may be completely wrong about this, and I would be quite interested in whatever comments people have to say about this on the threads, whether this is technically even possible. Perhaps it's not. But assuming that this is what is going on, why are the Ukrainians launching these pinprick attacks in this way against Crimea? Well, I'm going to make two suggestions. Firstly, it's clearly, as that interview between the Guardian journalist and the Ukrainian general showed, it's clearly partly a way of diverting attention away from the fact that there is no Kherson counteroffensive underway. So you don't want to talk about the Kherson counteroffensive anymore, but you still want to give the impression that you're achieving something, so you carry out these small raids with little drones, and sometimes they do quite a lot of damage, as they did at Saki. Sometimes they don't do any damage at all. Sometimes they're shot down. But at least you have something that appears to be happening, and that might be quite important. And I think that is a possible explanation of what we're seeing. But another explanation is that we know that Ukraine has been furiously lobbying in Washington for the US to relent and to supply to Ukraine these longer-ranged, more powerful ATACMS missiles, guided missiles that can be launched from a pod, replacing the normal pod on the HIMARS missile launcher. And the US has up to now refused apparently to provide these ATACMS missiles because they fear it would be an escalation which the Russians would take very strong exception to. But it could be, or this is a possibility, that the Ukrainians want to use these missiles to launch strikes in Crimea itself. And what they're trying to do is tell the US, well, there's no real danger of any major Russian reaction if we obtain these missiles and launch strikes in Crimea, because you see we've been able to carry out these pinprick strikes in Crimea with our drones, and the Russians haven't launched massive retaliation in response. So you can provide us with these missiles and all will be well. I have to say, if that's the calculus, then I think it's a risky calculus. I think it's a completely different thing if Ukraine is carrying out attacks in Crimea with small makeshift drones. It'd be a completely different thing if they're carrying out missile strikes with much larger, far more powerful, much more sophisticated 300-kilometer missiles provided by the United States. So I don't personally see that the one follows from the other, but there was a delegation which apparently visited, a US delegation which apparently visited Kiev quite recently, and which has returned to the United States, and which has also said that the United States should up its supplies to Ukraine and presumably supply these ATACMS systems to Ukraine. And it may be that what we're seeing is some sort of lobbying effort underway. I hope that the US does not go down that particular route, that it sticks to its position, that it's not going to supply these ATACMS systems. I think if it does supply them, it will be seen by the Russians as a major escalation. But I will say in advance that I don't think in that case that it will change the ultimate trajectory of the war. As we can see, Ukraine is still losing. It's losing ground in Donbass, it's losing ground in Kharkiv region. It's not making any progress in Kherson region, where the great Kherson counteroffensive appears to have been called off. And of course, it's facing growing economic problems of its own. And latest developments suggest that those problems may be about to get even worse, because Ukraine has continued to shell the Zaporozhye nuclear power station. And that apparently has led the Russians to now say that they're going to take the Zaporozhye nuclear power station offline. And the Zaporozhye nuclear power station apparently provides Ukraine with 20% of its electricity. And not only that, but of course Ukraine is already experiencing losses of energy because there's been declines in the amount of gas that has been supplied to Ukraine, and of course there's increasing disruptions to the Ukrainian economy. So the loss of 20% of its energy might be a very serious problem for Ukraine. You would have thought so anyway. You would have thought that the Ukrainians would be working hard to keep the Zaporozhye nuclear power station back, keep it in operation. But that doesn't seem to be what they are doing. They have been continuing to shell the power station. And by the way, over the last few hours, both Russia and Ukraine have traded allegations that each is preparing to stage some major provocation at the nuclear power station, and that each side should be prepared for the dastardly activity of the other. Now, the nuclear power station saga brings me to this very strange summit meeting between Erdogan-Zelensky and the UN Secretary General Guterres in Lviv. Now, I have to say that this summit meeting gives every impression of having been an extraordinarily damp squib. I had been unsure what to expect from this meeting, but I'd expected some important declaration, maybe Turkey weighing in on Ukraine's side over the power station, the nuclear power station, or maybe Turkey announcing a further upgrade in its arms deliveries to Ukraine, or perhaps Turkey once more reiterating its support for Ukraine's NATO aspirations and the return of its territorial integrity, including Crimea. We didn't get anything like that, really. If anything of that nature was said, it was very, very low-key. Erdogan did suggest, again, that the war should be brought to an end by negotiations. He again proposed himself as a potential mediator, but he didn't seem to have much enthusiasm, didn't seem to give much enthusiasm to this. So the whole thing seemed, to me, very much of a damp squib. And there was discussion about the nuclear power station, but again, nothing very much seemed to come of it. There's been discussion about saying a group of inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency to see what's going on, something which everybody should support, by the way. But again, Guterres, the UN Secretary General, seems to have said that this can only happen if there's some sort of agreement to greenlight that mission from both Moscow and Kiev. And with the Russians and the Ukrainians trading accusations, that doesn't seem likely to happen for the time being. So the whole meeting seemed to be something of a damp squib. And I really do wonder why it happened at all. It seems to me that my previous hypothesis, that it's just Erdogan balancing, or at least appearing to balance between Ukraine and Russia. He's done massive deals with the Russians recently, and this has caused some disquiet, in fact a lot of disquiet in the West, and even some talk of sanctions against Turkey. So he goes to meet Zelensky, he meets Zelensky in Lviv, he doesn't take the train to go to Kiev as others have done, he doesn't want to meet Zelensky in Ukraine's actual capital and what is now increasingly frontline city. Instead, he flies to Lviv instead. So he has this very low-key meeting out of which not very much comes. And I wonder whether that is what Erdogan apparently always intended. In the meantime, Erdogan is apparently planning to telephone Putin again to brief him on the discussion with Zelensky. Not that discussion seems to have gone very far. And anyway, the whole thing at the moment looks like it was an event or something of a non-event. Anyway, there we are. So, in summary, continued pressure by the Russians on the front line, continuing actual Russian offensive action, and these rather theatrical moves by Ukraine in Crimea, and by the way also in Belgorod, pinprick attacks of little significance. When I say of little significance, I should just give an example. About a week ago, Ukraine claimed that the road and railway bridges over the Novaya Kharkova Dam in Kherson region, that traffic across those bridges had been closed. And this was picked up by the British Ministry of Defence, and it was repeated by various Western media sources. Yesterday, I saw photographic and film imagery purportedly from those road and railway bridges, at least with the road bridge over the Novaya Harkova Dam, and it showed traffic moving across that dam, as far as I could see, pretty much as usual, including, by the way, military trucks. So it doesn't seem as if Ukraine's shelling of these bridges has been quite as effective as some rather excited commentaries in the West and in Ukraine itself have suggested. So I think the same is true, by the way, of these attacks in Crimea. I suspect it's also true of the Zaporozhye nuclear power station, though I would say that the Russians have been using the shelling of the power station to ramp up their criticisms of Ukraine and to suggest that Ukraine is essentially a reckless state which shows no regard for the proper conduct of war. Anyway, there we are. That's the military situation. That's the situation on the front lines and, of course, within Ukraine itself. A steady, incremental, gradual Russian advance leading eventually to a collapse in Donbass, in the Donbass defences, leading, I strongly suspect, to a much faster, much more visibly faster Russian armoured offensive, probably at some point in the next few weeks, when these defences in Donbass finally crumble. Well, in the meantime, the economic war between the West and Russia goes on. And the situation in the West is getting bleaker. And I'm just going to take some headlines to illustrate this. Now, they're all from the Daily Telegraph, a newspaper, by the way, which I read without much pleasure. I don't find much pleasure in any particular British newspaper any longer. And I've never been, I must be said, a huge fan of the Telegraph. But it does seem to me that it's particularly close to the British government at the present time. And of course, it's been enthusiastic in its backing for Ukraine. And you would have expected that because it's close to the British government and it's so supportive of Ukraine, that if anything, it will want to downplay the disastrous economic situation, which, to be very clear, is a direct product of the economic war. Well, these are just three headlines, all from articles appearing today in the Telegraph on the 19th of August, taken almost at random, but all on economic topics. So we have one article, German factory prices surge to record high as energy crisis deepens. And then we go on to read, German factories suffered record cost increases in July as the energy crisis squeezing Europe piled more pressure on its largest economy. Producer prices rose a record 37.2% in the year to July, a shock increase driven chiefly by soaring energy prices, which rose 105% over the period. And then we read that Germany's finance ministry said the outlook for its economy was notably gloomy. And even with energy stripped out, prices were still 14.6% higher than a year before, according to Statistics Energy Status. So that's about Germany. And then we have another article. These are all articles on the same day, 19th August, all from one newspaper. And this one is about Britain. And it reads, record-breaking gloom grips Britain ahead of nightmare winter. The words nightmare being in quotation marks. And we then read, the subtitle of the article is Consumer Confidence Slumps to Lowest Ever Level as Businesses and Households Brace for Further Surge in Prices. A record-breaking economic gloom is gripping Britain as households brace for a nightmare winter of soaring costs. Meanwhile, separate data showed that a host of industries are in contraction, in a sign the country is teetering on the brink of recession. And the outlook darkened on every one of GFK's measures, with Britons feeling increasingly pessimistic about their own finances and the general economy, both at present and over the next year. And Joe Staton of GFK said, these findings point to a sense of capitulation of financial events moving far beyond the control of ordinary people, with headline after headline revealing record inflation eroding household buying power. The strain on the personal finances of many in the UK is alarming. Just making ends meet has become a nightmare, and the crisis of confidence will only worsen with the darkening days of autumn and the colder months of winter. And then there's a third article, the third article in the Daily Telegraph that I have, that I read, and this is also about Britain. It's by Matthew Lynn, again on the 19th of August. The financial system will be sorely tempted by our economic meltdown. Small businesses, private equity firms, borrowers and major banks are all on the line. And then he goes on to say, we are already at 10%, that's inflation. We may soon be at 12%, and before long we may well hit 15%, or even a genuinely scary 20%. We have already seen signs this week that inflation has started to soar out of control, that the Bank of England has lost control of prices, and the government is floundering around with little idea how to respond. Right now, most of the discussion around that is about how ordinary people will cope with the cost of living, and of course that is a huge issue. But there is something else to worry about. Sustained high inflation could trigger a financial crisis as well. When prices start to gallop ahead at the rate they are right now, that will impact inevitably on the financial system. And just as I was going through these three deeply gloomy articles, yet a fourth one has suddenly appeared. It's another one again, all in the Daily Telegraph. Interest rates must hit 6% to tame inflation, says founding Bank of England rate setter. Willem Buiter says policy will need to be seriously restrictive to reach 2% target. Well, terrible economic news all around. Indications that oil production around the world is maxed out. A report in Zero Hedge that the expected increase in exports of oil from Venezuela is failing to materialize. No surprise there. And all the indications point to an extremely difficult winter in Europe. And I'm going to suggest also in the United States too. There's been an inflation dip in the United States, which is not, in my opinion, going to be sustained. So what do you do in this situation? Well, for me, it's a no-brainer. You find a way out of this economic war by looking for a political solution to the crisis in Ukraine. Political leaders nowhere in the West seem to be willing so far to grasp that nettle. One wonders what has to happen before they will. Does Ukraine need to collapse? Does there have to be a military defeat? Do they really understand what that will do to their reputations and careers and to the confidence of Western electorates? Do they want to wait until the economies, their own economies, hit breaking point? Or would they rather be driven out of power before that happens? Anyway, Perhaps we're now seeing further signs of political tensions, the political tensions that all this is causing. Apparently in Germany, there now calls for Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor, to resign. Supposedly this isn't about Ukraine at all, it's about a financial scandal in which he's involved. If you believe that, then as I often say, I have a bridge to sell you. It looks to me as if this financial scandal may be a vehicle that some people are using to try to eject a chancellor from office who has led Germany into an absolute dead end. But who knows? Maybe he'll survive, maybe he'll pull something together, maybe the German government will somehow patch things up, though I can't help but think myself that Scholz is going to follow where Italy's Prime Minister Mario Draghi and British Prime Minister Boris Johnson have led. In other words, he'll be soon out, even though there's no reason to think that whoever takes over from him it will be any better or has any better ideas. But anyway, that's one example of how this crisis is starting to exact an ever greater political effect. We see other leaders like Finland's Prime Minister dancing. Well, why shouldn't she dance, I suppose? Though I have to say the video was really very exuberant. But it does make me feel, that sometimes at times of gathering economic gloom, the picture of a Prime Minister dancing in a rather exuberant way might not be the best message to send to people who are increasingly feeling the economic pinch. Apparently there's concerns in the Baltic states that they're running out of energy as well and that their people might start to get cold in the winter. That would be richly ironic, by the way, given that it's the Baltic states who have been pushing the hardest line possible against Russia. But all of this is happening and there's still no new thinking on the horizon. How much longer must this go on? The president of Indonesia says that President Putin of Russia and President Xi of China will be attending the G20 summit in Indonesia fairly soon. All the Western leaders will be there as well. If they want to do serious diplomacy, the venue is there for them to do it. They should seize the chance, in my opinion. I'm afraid they won't. Well, we shall see what happens, but eventually, sooner or later, events will take their course and some kind of a solution will be dictated, and it will not be the one the Western leaders want. Well, thank you for joining me today for this program. Remember, you can watch all our programs, Duran programs, my programs, local or Alex Christoforou programs on our other platforms, first and foremost locals, but also Rumble and ODYSEE and our Telegram channel. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and you can also check us out, and you can also check out our shop, find the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, all those great things. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button, and last but not least, please check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. There'll be more from me soon. Have a very good day. Until then.